Hello, my name is Jeremy Collins. I'm the Director of Conferences and Symposia here at the National World War II Museum's Institute for the Study of War and Democracy. And we have a great program for you today. It is going to feature Dr. William Sturkey and Dr. Jason Dawsey. This is continuing the rich and wonderful content the museum's been providing throughout this Black History Month. It's a great story for this particular month, but it's a great story for any month. And to lead us in this conversation, it's my pleasure to hand it off to the Institute's research historian, Dr. Jason Dawsey. Jason?
Jeremy, thank you very much. Let me extend my welcome to everyone out there as well to this webinar, Give Us Faith, African Americans and the Home Front. And we're delighted to be joined for this webinar by Dr. William Sturkey. So I wanted to say a little bit about Dr. Sturkey before we begin our conversation. He is historian of the modern American South at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where he teaches courses on modern American history, Southern history, the civil rights movement, and the history of America in the 1960s. His first book, To Write in the Light of Freedom, is a co-edited collection of newspapers, essays, and poems produced by African-American Freedom School students during the Mississippi Freedom Summer of 1964. His most recent book, and I have a copy of it right here for those who are interested. His most recent book is Hattiesburg, An American City in Black and White, a biracial history of Jim Crow, that was published by Harvard University Press in March of 2019. So William, with that introduction, let me just say it's great to see you. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Jason, thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here.
William and I, this is for our audience, should be aware that for William and I, this webinar is a bit of reconnecting. We were both teaching at the University of Southern Mississippi several years ago as we were getting close to finishing our PhDs up. Our dissertations were kind of getting very close to completion at that point, and we were on the same wing of the liberal arts building there, and used to talk, college football, about teaching, and about history. And so this has been really great, William, that we can kind of resume some of those conversations from several years ago. So for a topic like this, it's a huge topic. There's so much to it, William. There's always the issue of what you include, what you realize you can't get to, where do you start, where do you wrap up? And so it seemed like one place to really begin, a really interesting point to begin a conversation, William, is with African Americans in Pearl Harbor. And so where I wanted to start with that is to ask about if you could tell our audience something in general about how Black Americans responded to December 7th, 1941. Were their reactions really any different from that of other groups in the U.S.? And then a final point is a political one, in that African Americans have begun to vote in large numbers for the Democratic Party. And do you think that made any real difference in the way they responded to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor?
Great, Jason. Well, thank you. So, broadly speaking, African Americans reacted to the attack on Pearl Harbor just like many other Americans. This sense of shock and dismay that their country had been attacked. And, they were stunned, and most people didn't know, of course, the inner workings of this burgeoning rivalry in the Pacific, that predated Pearl Harbor for decades. And they were just so stunned that America had been attacked by an enemy that they didn't believe we were at war with, which was technically true. And so African Americans, many people, Black folks, rushed to join the military in the wake of Pearl Harbor. They wanted to help defend their country. One of the early heroes of Pearl Harbor, in fact, was an African American, that man named Dory Miller, right, who was aboard the West Virginia during the attack at Pearl Harbor, and then, of course, worked to save the lives of many of his fellow soldiers. And so, yeah, African Americans were, chomping at the bit, oftentimes, to go ahead and join military service in order to help the United States in this fight after the attack. I think that it was pretty universal for African Americans to, be inspired to pick up this call to defend the country, not just for people who supported Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party, but even for Black Republicans too. In the 1940s, there were plenty of Black Republicans. There were plenty of Black Republicans really up until the 1964 election. So whether they were Democrat or Republican, African Americans jumped at the chance in many occasions to help defend their country in the wake of that attack.
Thank you. I'm glad you brought up the reference to Dory Miller. The museum has had some programming about him recently, and his story is so important and interesting. And what is interesting, William, about 1941, prior to Imperial Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, is that had been quite a year already in the African-American community around issues about freedom and democracy, which of course were going to be central to the war effort, to the way the United States understood the war, the way it waged the war, how it talked about the importance of fighting and winning that war. And that this is a question here about the March on Washington. And I think when many Americans hear those words, March on Washington, they automatically think about 1963 and about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous I Have a Dream speech. But there was plans for an earlier march on Washington going back to 1941. And could you tell us about what was involved with this earlier march and what happened to it? What happened to the idea for the march?
Yeah, sure. So this is one of the more fascinating sort of what ifs in American history. What if this march would have actually happened? And so this march was planned largely by this guy named A. Philip Randolph. A. Philip Randolph was the head of a union, right? An all-Black union of sleeping car porters. And he had been the head of this union basically since the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. Now, this union started off pretty small, but it had been growing through the 1930s and going into the 1940s. It was getting pretty big and pretty influential. They met in Harlem. That's where they were largely headquartered. And, they were pretty influential in terms of getting people who worked on trains into this union and fighting for increased African-American civil rights. Because they were becoming so influential in New York, especially, both in the state and in the city of New York, a lot of white politicians, stopped by their organization or at their convention to speak, to pay homage, because they wanted the Black vote. And so their union meeting in 1940 attracts thousands of people. But among the thousands of people who come to that meeting are New York City Mayor LaGuardia, New York State Governor and future Senator Herbert Lehman, the United States Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins, and the First Lady herself was at this union meeting. And she speaks to the union meeting that night. She says, and I quote, "The color line is gradually being broken down and becoming a thing of the past." All the other speakers get up and they say, "We're going to attack Jim Crow in the South. Okay, we're going to make sure African Americans have the right to vote." 12 days after that meeting, the president hosts the head of the NAACP and A. Philip Randolph in the White House. A couple of weeks after that, he appoints the first Black general. Okay, so there's this growing sense that African Americans in this growing voting bloc, that the Democratic Party needs to do something to address their concerns, especially coming out of New York. Now, at about this exact same time, A. Philip Randolph says, "I'm going to flex my muscle just a little bit. We want even more. What we're going to do is we're going to demonstrate on Washington." Okay, what they want to do is they want to desegregate the armed forces, is one of the things that they're calling for. And they're also continuing this push to end Jim Crow in the South. And so they plan this march for 1941. And they think that by the late spring of 1941, they think there's going to be about 100,000 African Americans who are going to show up to this march. So, of course, the famous march in 1963 was about 250,000. They think about 100,000 people in 1941 were going to come to this, which would have been a very large number of people to demonstrate on the Mall in Washington, especially at a moment where the United States has not yet entered the war, but it's made very clear which side it's on, okay? The President of the United States has signed on to this Atlantic Charter, okay, with the British. he's also consistently calling the war a war for democracy, saying that the United States is on the right side of this conflict, even though it's not formally in it yet. It's still helping out, Britain and Russia. And so this would have been enormously embarrassing on the world stage if all these Black people came and demonstrated, right, over the violations to their civil rights in this country, as the United States was saying, we're the good guys here across the globe. And so what happened basically was that, A. Philip Randolph was convinced by the Roosevelt administration to call off the march, which is exactly what they did. And in response to that, there were some promises made that, okay, after the war, we're going to really, take a harder line on civil rights, which they did. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt didn't live to see that. But what Franklin Roosevelt did live to see, and what he did do, was Executive Order 8802, which created the Fair Employment Practices Commission. And there's a lot of things we could say about that, but the most important thing is this. That required that if you got a defense contract during the war, and there were a lot of defense contracts going around, everybody wanted a defense contract, okay? It said that if you get one, you can't segregate in your factory. And that was huge, right? And so that wasn't actually largely enforced. So it wasn't huge in terms of desegregating all factories in the South, although a couple were desegregated. But it was the promise of the federal government coming in and saying segregation in these southern states is wrong. And we're not going to do business with companies that have segregation or with cities that have segregation. And so it's sort of this seed that's planted, right? After the war, a lot of people called for a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission. But it's this seed that's planted that says the federal government will step up and protect African American civil rights in the South.
I'm really glad you mentioned the name A. Philip Randolph in there. William, he's a figure that often could get overlooked in the history of the later civil rights era because of the importance of figures like Dr. King and others in SCLC, except there were so many, kind of a younger leadership group there, but A. Philip Randolph had been such an enormous figure in the American labor movement and in the struggling against Jim Crow, et cetera, and seeing his role right here in 1941, even before the U.S. gets into war. And that, speaking of the issue of labor and the war, you've already talked about African Americans signing up to fight in large numbers, and obviously large numbers of Black men and women will be entering the workforce, and as part of winning the war effort at home. Obviously, there had been huge numbers already in the workforce. So we want to kind of talk about the issue of African Americans' labor and the war effort here with a couple of questions, William. And so the first one is this, is that when we deal with this issue about Black workers and the war effort, what should we know about their experience of the war? What do you think is really significant, distinct about that? And then a follow-up is that what did the shift to war production mean for African American women?
So African Americans played enormous roles in making all of the goods that we use to make war. Okay. So a lot of factories were still segregated in some places, despite the FEPC, which was only loosely enforced. But in major industrial centers like Detroit, in Oakland, California, in Los Angeles, in Philadelphia, Black folks go and apply for the jobs that are being produced by this need to make all of the bombs and the tanks and the planes. This is total war, okay? So once the United States starts producing war-making materials in 1940, the economy just starts to boom coming out of the Great Depression. And African Americans get a lot of these jobs. We think there are about 17 million new jobs created during World War II, largely in this defense industry. And wages start to go up, right? There's a lot more money to go around. And Black folks want to get a lot of these jobs. Unemployment falls to virtually zero, right, during World War II. And so African Americans move to places where these jobs are. This is one of the big shifts that happens. We think roughly about 1.5 million Black folks moved largely out of the Jim Crow South to places like Pennsylvania, California, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, places like that. So there's a huge Great Migration. That's one of the most obvious effects here is this huge Great Migration of Black people out of states like Mississippi. In 1940, there were more Black people in Mississippi than white people. By 1950, that was not true because so many Black people had left. And so that's one of the big parts of this shift is that it changes the actual demographics of our country, right? All the Black people that go to Harlem and Detroit and Chicago, right? Many of them are still there, but that's when many of the people's families first arrived in those places. Okay, so Black folks getting better jobs, using those better wages to buy new homes where they could, to pay for rents in northern cities where they could. Not everything was peachy, certainly, but a lot of African Americans became middle class at that time, if you will, because they were able to tap into these war industry jobs. For African American women, especially working outside of the South, they were able to get jobs that were well paying for the first time in many of their lives. So if you are a Black woman and you lived in Alabama before World War II, the only job you could probably get was working as a domestic, right? Being somebody's maid or their nanny or their cook or something like that. If you had a college degree, maybe you could be a teacher, but that's pretty much it. But if you leave Alabama and you go to Oakland, you could get a job as a welder, right? You could join a union. You could get a good hourly wage paying job that paid you 800 or 900% more even than what you were making back in Alabama washing people's sheets in their backyard. So it was just enormously transformative for many African Americans and their families who moved out of the South, especially to take these jobs. But even for the people that stayed in the South, it was enormously transformative because a lot of them still worked in defense industries. Even if they didn't necessarily take a job in one of the factories in New Orleans, for example, a lot of them could take a job on an Army base. And if you are washing laundry on an Army base, you're probably making more than if you were washing laundry in that small town of Alabama. So African Americans tapping in, and it leads to this great migration, the second great migration. And then, of course, it leads to an improved economic outlook or financial outlook for a lot of African American families.
Yeah, you're really kind of drawing our attention to just how transformative the war was on the home front for African Americans. William, just I mean, people especially after the Great Depression, that compounded by Jim Crow, if they're in the South, and then now they're seeing real opportunities open up. It may require them to move, but there are real opportunities for getting a better life, at least economically, even in the Jim Crow South, which we're going to get to in a few questions here.
Let me just add one more thing, Jason.
Please.
Something that I think that people take for granted is, our current political makeup. Okay, how do we get all these? We just saw this in the last presidential election. There's all these Black voters in Detroit and Milwaukee. Well, how do they get there? It's literally World War II. That's how Black people largely get to places like Detroit and Milwaukee. And so one of the things that happens right out of the war is we get Black congressmen coming out of Harlem, coming out of Chicago, coming out of Detroit, right? That's all because of the Great Migration. We also get national presidential elections where people have to pay more attention to Black voters. Because when African Americans moved during World War II, they moved very selectively, actually. They moved almost exclusively to 7 states. Okay, follow me here. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio, California, Illinois. You take those states in the presidential election, you're doing pretty well. Okay, California, Michigan, Ohio, etc. And so because of that, even in 1948, 1952, a lot of national politicians have to start looking more toward Black voters who now live in places like Ohio where they can vote. And before, if they lived in Mississippi, they couldn't. So it really transforms, our national elections in that way.
Right. And that, and we're still seeing, as you point out, like the effects of this about the enhancement of Black political power in so many different states in World War II was crucial to that. And I think maybe at the end, we may be able to come back and say more about that. Now, William, I think one of the things that always comes up when you talk about African Americans in the home front during the Second World War, I think much of our audience is already at least generally aware of this, but it's definitely worth revisiting and detailing, which is the Double V campaign. Can you tell us about how this campaign originated and how it became such a, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say this, it became a national phenomenon during World War II.
Yeah, so double V just means victory at home, victory abroad. And this term is coined by the Pittsburgh Courier. And it largely comes out of a response from World War One. When World War One happened, a lot of Black national leaders and newspapers said, okay, if we're going to go fight for the country, we want to have greater civil rights. Okay. And when World War II happened, Black people still couldn't vote in most of the South. And they said, okay, this time, really, okay, the president is constantly talking about this being a war for democracy. This is a war against fascism. Okay, let's make sure that we can participate in the democracy here if we're going to now have this global understanding that democracy beats fascism. Okay. And so it's constantly during the war saying, yes, go out, buy your liberty bonds, work in the factories, serve your country. But when this is over, we got to bring that democracy home. So constantly reminding people through this Double V campaign about the stakes of the war in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, but then also reminding people what the stakes of the war were back here in the United States of America. So that's the Double V campaign, coined by the Pittsburgh Courier, but used by all sorts of Black leaders everywhere. It's all over the media.
Yeah, and it does really become this moment for not only for African Americans. I think when you look at other countries too, who are aware of the Black freedom struggle and what that's going to mean, what kind of impact that's going to have as well, which it has a kind of transnational, international echo as well. So that's really important, I think, to give us some perspective on how this started and how it's going to be really transformative in the country. In terms of your own work, well, you've already referred several times to the Jim Crow South and to the state of Mississippi. And want to have a few questions here that really connect to your very important 2019 book on the city of Hattiesburg, a city obviously both of us know well, where we were living and working at when we met. So a couple of things here about the city of Hattiesburg, about the state of Mississippi. Your scholarship has explored Jim Crow segregation there in Mississippi. How did the wartime expansion of the training center at Camp Shelby, we're talking here really about for our audience, this is about 100 miles from us here in New Orleans. How did the wartime expansion of the training center at Camp Shelby impact a Deep South town like Hattiesburg?
Yeah. So there's a lot to say there, and I think this is endlessly fascinating. I think because this struggle about fighting this war for democracy, and you have this issue of the Jim Crow South, but not only that, the other issue here is this total war. So World War II is the last time that the United States was engaged in what we might think of as being a total war. And that means just throw everything down, everything else is secondary, everything is aside, everybody's involved, little kids picking up bottles to men fighting, on the front lines. Everyone do whatever it takes. But the one exception to that total war, right, where we don't actually say, okay, let's throw all this aside for now so we can go fight the Nazis, is Jim Crow itself. And so what happens in Hattiesburg? Hattiesburg had a World War I era military base. And because the South had better weather, when the United States began to mobilize before Pearl Harbor even happened, it starts sending troops out to these troop training centers. It revitalizes a lot of former World War I installations like Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and it starts sending all these troops there. But there's a problem, right? And the problem itself is Jim Crow. So when they're getting African Americans and training them to go fight overseas, and about 1 million Black people served overseas in World War II, they can't just say, okay, we got a base here, go send them. They can't just say that because it's the Jim Crow South. If you're sending Black troops to Texas or Alabama or Mississippi or Louisiana, you've got to think, okay, how are they going to fit into that society? Because with all the things we're willing to compromise to fight this war, that is one thing they will not compromise. So you can't just say, okay, we got 25,000 Black troops, let's send them here. It's a negotiation, right, between the local Chamber of Commerce, the local Army commanders, the local Black community that already existed, and leaders who want to have these guys trained up. So that's one of the issues that the Army constantly faced in a place like Hattiesburg, Hattiesburg had this thing where black soldiers couldn't ride in a taxi with white soldiers. Okay. So the taxi companies are saying, well, if I've got a capacity for 4 passengers and I've got 2 black soldiers and 2 white soldiers and they both want to go to the same place, the city's like, no, no, no. Sorry, must have segregation. So there's all these little ways that it's incredibly inconvenient, right, to try and make war in a place like Hattiesburg, Mississippi, or in the South in general. And then they got to, then there's like, well, where do we put all these folks? Where do they go and stay? How do we make sure the black troops, when they leave the base, go to the black community and the white troops only go to the white community? And there's several dust ups. There's a couple guys that end up getting shot. They're in downtown Hattiesburg. They get shot by this white cop. Thankfully they were not killed, but soldiers they didn't think were acting appropriately. So that's a very, very tricky situation all over the South. And you can only imagine the nightmare, but then also the frustration where you can't just go say, okay, we're in a total war. Let's go balls to the wall, do whatever we have to do. No, you got local segregation ordinances. But the other thing is the people of Hattiesburg go nuts when Camp Shelby starts to mobilize. The same is true all over the South because they're getting guys coming in with big government checks, right? They're getting soldiers coming in who are getting paid. They also need a lot of construction crews. They need a lot of workers. This is a region that's coming out of the Great Depression. Things were bleak, okay, all across the South. And when you start building, mess halls and field hospitals and that sort of thing, that provides jobs. They get people, when they start the construction program at Camp Shelby, they get people came from 17 different states, right? They get a guy that hitchhiked from Rhode Island to take one of those jobs. It's a huge financial boom to the local economy in Hattiesburg and everywhere that had a military base. But then also during the war, they need all sorts of things, right? Soldiers need stuff. They need things to eat. They need things to do. So local farmers, what happens with them? It's all looking great. Local construction crews, people that run the movie houses. It's a great financial opportunity for the city of Hattiesburg. There's this issue with race, as I've been discussing, but overall, it's an incredible economic boost to the local economy in Hattiesburg and elsewhere.
No, it's such an important moment in that city's history, William. I think living there, we used to see, you could get some remnants of that and stories about that, but your research has really filled that out, showed just, in terms of the kind of, as you call it, kind of biracial history of Hattiesburg, just what kind of impact the war had. And I wanted this next question is a kind of elaboration on that, which is, could you say more about some of the specific challenges the U.S. Army faced in Hattiesburg? You kind of noted that or alluded to that already, but to develop that a bit, because they were very distinct challenges that the Army encountered having such a huge operation in a place like Camp Shelby.
Yeah, so one of the challenges was this race issue. And one of the things that they did have going for them in Hattiesburg was that Hattiesburg had a very vibrant Black community. And so because of that, they could work with the leaders of that Black community, local businessmen, teachers, and clergy. That's largely who they worked with. And Hattiesburg actually built a Black USO, one of the few places in the country that built a brand new Black USO just to have a place for all the Black soldiers to go. It's actually still, to this day, it's the only standing Black USO that was built originally during World War II. Now it's a military museum. So there's this challenge of race and, what do you do with all these folks that need to go up to town? But honestly, the biggest challenge that the Army had in Hattiesburg was about price control. So, people are coming in, they got their girlfriends, they got their wives, they want to spend time in town, they want to go out, they want to have a good time, they're going off to war. They also want to go to church, right? There's a lot of people who just want to go to town and go to church on Sunday, get off the base with the Army chaplain and go to actual, Presbyterian or Methodist or whatever they were, But when they're doing that, they're getting gouged because all the local people who own property know the soldiers have nowhere else to go. So they start throwing up blankets in rooms, dividing them up and charging these exorbitant prices. And the local Army folks are like begging people, stop charging them 8 or 9 times what you should be getting in rent. They're just gouging these guys, charging them $9-10 a night just because they knew that they could. So there's this conversation with this price control issue too. People and locals in Hattiesburg make a killing on charging rent to the soldiers during World War II.
Incredible. And we'll probably have some more questions regarding the Deep South and African Americans and the war when we get to the Q&A. But this next question takes us out of the South to a really crucial moment of the war, and that's Detroit in 1943. William, there's obviously this stereotype still endures about wartime unity, and what we see in a place like Detroit in 1943 with a race riot there is the limits of that unity. It's an important moment and it's often overlooked. Can you talk about the Detroit race riot of 1943 and what exactly happened there, and how we should think about this in relation to the larger war effort and the home front for African Americans?
Yeah, man. So there are two stories from World War II that when you tell young people today, it just blows their mind. This and the Soldiers Vote Bill too, which I'd be happy to also talk about. But yeah, Detroit 1943 had a race riot. So you're right, exactly. The middle of World War II, we got a total war. America's, unity, pulling together, fighting the Nazis. And in the middle of all this, there's a race riot. So Detroit is obviously a booming industrial center at this moment in time. Okay, between 1940, when the US really starts gearing up for the war, and 1943, about 550,000 people moved to Detroit. That's probably more people than actually live in Detroit proper today. An enormous amount of people moved to Detroit. Now, about 500,000 of those people are white, and about 50,000 of those people were black. Okay, many of them came from the South. And so African Americans are there getting some of the jobs that we talked about. And there's a public housing program, okay, to house all these people. You've got to do something if you're the government, right, to make homes for all of these people pouring into the city. And so when Black people were accepted into a public housing project, right, that also had white people in there, this riot broke out. Thousands of local whites began attacking Black people across this city in this movement to resist integrated public housing, right? And there's some great pictures of this that you can find. But so 1943, in the middle of this war, Detroit has what we call a race riot. 34 people were killed during these sort of grassroots acts of violence throughout the city. Several hundred others were wounded. And during this major military emergency of World War II, the United States had to call in 6,000 troops, not to go to Burma, not to go to Japan, to go to Detroit to put down this race riot in the middle of this war for democracy, which is pretty mind-blowing, I think, if you really think about it.
It really is. It's I think one of the reasons why it's so important to not lose it when one's talking about the history of the war and the sort of spirit of democracy, the anti-fascist struggle that this happens. And it's not just any city, it's the Motor City, it's Detroit, a center of the American economy, had been for decades, where that breaks out. So I think that's very helpful for us, William, to when we're thinking about these issues about unity and about the war effort and about the role of democracy and expectations of democracy and equality and how that actually plays out during the war itself. Well, this next question is, I think, something that's been of great interest to you, when we're to really two bills that have a huge impact on African Americans, not only on African Americans, but certainly on them. And I think we could take them in this order, which is one that I think is also overlooked, which is the Soldiers Vote Bill. And then how the GI Bill, how that affects African Americans. So because these two bills, they really do have a huge effect, a huge impact.
Yeah. So the Soldiers Vote Bill, 1944, right? This is the one presidential election that is square in the middle of World War II. Okay. So World War II affects many elections, but this is the one that's right in the middle of the conflict. And of course, this is a war for democracy. Okay. And so because it's a war for democracy, because there are men stationed all across the globe fighting in this war for democracy, a lot of politicians want to make sure that the very soldiers fighting the war can vote themselves. Okay, this makes perfect sense. The guys fighting for democracy should be allowed to participate in the democracy. Great. Okay. So we passed this soldiers vote bill or introduced this soldiers vote bill, but there's a hiccup to this soldiers vote bill. You might think that all politicians would say, yes, the men fighting for democracy, of course they can participate in the democracy, but not everybody thinks so. And so what happens is that there's a deal brokered in Congress, which basically allows the decision to fall back on the states. So it's not going to be the federal government mandating that all states have to accept all these soldiers' absentee ballots that are going to come in from all across the globe. It falls back on states to run their own elections, which is essentially what states do anyway. And so some of the states decide to allow absentee ballots to come in from soldiers. Okay. North Carolina is one of those states, but a few states decline this opportunity. Okay. Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and they all say, no, we're not going to let absentee ballots come in from soldiers stationed overseas. And a lot of your audience can probably understand why. When you get an absentee ballot, you can't tell if the person who sent it all the time was black or white. And so because they didn't want to allow African American soldiers to vote because they could not actually see them to judge their race, they decided to reject absentee ballots and not allow American soldiers to vote during this war for democracy. And so this is one of the saga with the soldiers vote bills. It's just maybe the most stunning contradiction of the entire war itself. The guys actually doing the fighting on the ground aren't allowed to vote because of Jim Crow era voting restrictions. The GI Bill, there's a lot we could say about this. Okay, let me give you just the basic good news and bad news. We'll do bad news first. So the GI Bill itself is not necessarily segregated. But again, so the federal government, largely in response to what happened with the bonus army in the 1930s, says we got to do something more for these guys to help them. And it's also right in line with New Deal era, economic thinking. Let's empower people to be able to participate in the economy. Okay, great. So we're going to give soldiers opportunities to get some tuition money if they want to go to college, to get money if they want to go apprentice as a plumber or something like that, and then also to buy a home. Okay, we'll give them low interest mortgages to buy a home. Sounds great in principle. The law can apply to people who served, black or white. Awesome. The problem, though, is that segregation prevented all people from accessing all benefits equally. So, for example, if you are an African American from New York City, you go fight in the war, and then you try and get the GI Bill. You might be very successful in doing that. You might get your loan. But guess what? There's entire neighborhoods on Long Island that don't allow black people to live there. Okay. So in that regard, you can't use the GI Bill in the same way. You might be able to buy another home in a neighborhood that, might not have the same sort of increase in equity over generations, right? So that's one way. If you're from the South, if you're Medgar Evers, for example, Medgar Evers dropped out of high school in response to Pearl Harbor and went and fought for his country. He couldn't go to the University of Mississippi. He got the GI Bill. He couldn't go to Ole Miss, right? He had to go to the black college, and he got a great education at that black college. But that's one way that the GI Bill, was itself discriminatory because black people could not access all the possible benefits of using that GI Bill itself. So, sorry, I shouldn't call the GI Bill itself was not discriminatory, but the way that people who got it could access resources certainly was. But the good news, on the other hand, is that it does help a lot of people jump up into the middle class. And Medgar Evers is a great example of that. He got to go to college because of that. He went to college, he got a job, he became a middle class African American at the time. And one of the things that we see in the wake of World War II is the African American economic situation improving greatly because of a lot of the work and stuff we've been talking about, but also the GI Bill. Okay, people can start businesses, they can get, loans to do that. A lot of people can go to college. And so there were many benefits, even though they weren't quite the same benefits that white people might be able to access. And a lot of people who end up with this GI Bill, Medgar Evers, and again, end up becoming involved with the civil rights movement because they were able to use it to start a business or go to college. They weren't as reliant on a white employer as they might have been in the past.
Thank you, William. That's really fascinating about how these bills, on the one hand, like the Soldiers Vote bill, really exemplifies how tenacious segregationists are about trying to realizing really that the war is going to empower African Americans, it's going to open doors for them, and fearful of that, and them trying to keep that at bay, even as this war is being fought in the name of protecting democracy and crushing fascism. And then the case of even the GI Bill has this sort of two-sided, aspect, but it does obviously offer real opportunities for African Americans. Looking at our time here, William, we are kind of getting into the Q&A part of our presentation. So there's obviously so much more to say here, and questions are already coming in. And one that's already come in is following up on your comments about Medgar Evers, which is that, could you say something more about the role that African American World War II veterans like Evers plays in the early, in this case, early as in immediate post-war years of what we're going to come to understand as the civil rights movement or modern civil rights movement?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways to think of this. One of the more famous is the Swedish sociologist Gunnar Myrdal publishes this book, An American Dilemma, noting the very obvious differences between our message of fighting for democracy and the realities of Black life in the Jim Crow South. And then, of course, there's a lot of people that observe this contradiction. And I think, I think that's a little bit overblown. Black people certainly knew that there was already a contradiction way before World War II. They didn't need a fight against the Nazis to show them that. But a lot of people, I think, were just essentially fed up. There were people who, if you go through the process of going to boot camp, of getting on a ship and going and risking your life and fighting overseas, and you come back and they tell you that you can't vote, a lot of people just simply had it. Medgar Evers, Amzie Moore, many people involved in the civil rights movement come back. And what they almost exclusively focus on, I know that, obviously the civil rights movement is a lot of marches and sit-ins and things like that. These people want to vote. That's what they're most worried about, right? They're not necessarily worried about going to the water fountain or whatever. They want to vote. They want to participate in the democracy. And so that's one of the things that the Black vets in particular, really focus on. And a lot of them, again, it's just, they had just had enough, right? They just weren't going to live like that anymore after what they had been through.
Yeah, that's so important. In fact, one of our other audience members wanted to follow up on that very point, William, about how African American veterans coming back just resolved to not take this anymore. That after everything that's been fought for, to come back and be denied just basic civil rights that other Americans enjoyed. This is from Jay, and his question is that do you see a similar resolve among Black workers, those who had been on the home front, had been part of the contributing to the arsenal of democracy, that when the war ends, we've already talked about a figure like A. Philip Randolph. You see in terms of Black workers a similar kind of determined, resolute attitude?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing that is a little bit tricky though is that it largely is it's best seen in the North. That's what I really want to say. I wish I could say that you saw this groundswell of people in this all across the South who had been working in these factories, but because so many people had moved to the North, that's where you really get that groundswell. People start to join the NAACP, for one, in places like New York and New Jersey and California, NAACP membership begins to skyrocket. In 1940, the NAACP had about 50,000 members. By 1946, the NAACP has about 500,000 members. And so that's one of the ways that Black workers begin to get involved. Many of them begin to join civil rights organizations like the NAACP. They also begin to vote. They're very active politically. They're putting pressure on different people in places like Detroit and New York and California, where Black people can vote. They're putting pressure on city leaders to desegregate, to do something about the South. Now, what happens in the South comes a little bit slower, but you start to see some real results coming out of the North. One, Truman desegregates the military in 1948, okay? That's one of the things that happens as this result of the pressure instigated by A. Philip Randolph, but then also Black voters, Black workers who were paying attention afterward. But then all sorts of different, different levels of desegregation in American life begin to occur in the 1950s. Jackie Robinson, 1947. There's no coincidence that that happens right after World War II as the Black community in New York grows and increases, not just in its awareness, but its sort of resolve to fight for civil rights, pressuring local leaders to say, let's desegregate the Brooklyn Dodgers, you know? And so that's where you really start to see this initial groundswell is outside of the South, even though it will sort of eventually trickle into the South. In 1948, the first presidential election after World War II, both the Democratic and the Republican parties have civil rights as part of their platform that year, okay? We often think of sort of white Southerners leaving the Democratic Party, but white Southerners needed a place to go if they were segregationists. And in 1948, they couldn't go to the Democratic Party or the Republican Party because both those parties were nodding to Black voters. So they formed their own Dixiecrat Party and left the Democratic Party. And that's also a result of these Black workers who had moved out of the South and were becoming more influential in politics by the late 1940s.
That's great. That actually leads to your comment about the two-party system. This next question, William, is really about the Democratic Party in particular. About, do you think that one of the reasons why segregation was not challenged any more than it was during the war itself was the influence that Southern Democrats still had within the party and on FDR himself? Would you attribute it to that, or you see other factors playing a role in the unwillingness to more directly contest Jim Crow?
Yeah, so, the Southern Democrats' influence on FDR, it shapes American life in so many different ways, but, largely through his New Deal programs, segregating things like Social Security, public housing, things like that. That has a major effect, I think, largely before the war. During the war, I think that, a lot of people are busy, obviously occupied with the war, and there are limitations because of that. But, there is sort of a more silent fight going on, for example, about who gets to live in public housing in places like Detroit or in places like Hattiesburg, Mississippi, even. And even though that there is some advancement, there are people who come back and have the exact opposite view as African Americans. Okay, the man that killed Medgar Evers was also a World War II veteran. And many people thought that, okay, this is a war to protect our way of life. And for them, that way of life was directly related to racial segregation and white supremacy. So these fights continue. And so what happens in the late 1940s is that Truman is being pushed on one hand from the Black voters to have a permanent FEPC, Fair Employment Practices Commission, to say that if the federal government does business with any of these places, they need to desegregate. And the white South loses their mind over this. It's one of the things that's really underappreciated, I think, in modern US history. But the threat of the FEPC was always there during World War II. But after World War II, when African Americans were like, let's make this permanent, no segregation in defense industries, that never actually happened. And that's because the enormous backlash, and the Dixiecrats were part of that backlash as well. So, it wasn't this gradual march toward progress. There were many people who wanted to fight the oncoming racial desegregation that, people were starting to really talk about, especially in the North in the late 1940s.
Great. Thank you. I mean, that leads to the next question then, which is that obviously for African Americans, there is a focus with the Double V campaign on winning victory at home and victory abroad. At this point, how international is African American sense about racism being an issue not only for them, but for peoples in Africa, for peoples in Asia, that white supremacy as a category, there's people who raise like, when does that really become such an important category for people opposing racism? And did people in the Black freedom struggle, when did they start seeing themselves as part of this international problem that racism has to be defeated really across the world? And I think you've already pointed to a little bit of that too, William, about obviously Black veterans they're in the Pacific, right? They're in Europe. They're seeing very different places, encountering very different social and cultural institutions and situations there. So this is really a question about a sense of internationalism coming into the civil rights movement.
Yeah, so I think especially on the far left, if you will, of Black activists, especially in the 1930s, had always viewed this as theirs as an international struggle. And that, there are some elements of African American life that go back to Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. They viewed it as an international struggle. But where most Black people, where this really begins to enter their consciousness is especially in the 1950s. And the conversation's going both ways, okay? The Atlantic Charter here is key. Before the United States gets into World War II, right, it signs on to this Atlantic Charter about what the world is going to look like after the United States and its ally had won this peace. And one of those visions was for sovereignty, sovereign nations, the end of colonialism, basically, a system that had existed for 70, 80 years across the globe. And all these countries, or many of whom, have a lot of non-white people in them, like India, the whole continent of Africa, Vietnam. These folks are like, great, this Atlantic Charter, wonderful. Once the war's over, let's get it going. So 1945, really 1947 to like 1963 is this enormous wave of creations of new countries or overthrowing colonial governments, starting with India, right, moving on to French Indochina, right, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, the whole continent of Africa. And as that's happening, Black Americans are paying attention, especially in Africa, right? So like Martin Luther King Jr., when he becomes famous in the mid-50s, he goes to Ghana, okay? Many Black leaders also spent time in India, right? Connecting this sort of international issue. And the Black press, especially in the 1950s, the Black press is all over what's happening in Africa, right? Saying these folks in Africa who are overthrowing the yoke of colonization, right? And they get democracy. That's, those are our brothers, right? Those are our allies. And if they can do it there, we want to do it here too. And of course, as this is all happening, the United States is, we're creating the UN, international governing bodies, and Black Americans are very much tying into these conversations saying, okay, let's do it here next, right? We feel very connected to what's happening in West Africa. Let's do it here too.
Yeah, by bringing that in, well, you're sort of, reminding us about the ties that African Americans had to Pan-Africanism going back at least to the 1920s, that they were playing a role in those conversations well before World War II. And that may be kind of a place to conclude. Is that for, the issue of the links, right, between World War II and the civil rights era. I think people wanting to see what do we do with these, or how do we think about, these links? As you point out, it was civil rights, the struggle for freedom and equality was hardly new in 1941. That had been ongoing for decades. But is there something you might say by way of summary for us to think about what exactly do we do with these links? Obviously the civil rights movement, there were other issues that would have helped it come about without World War II, but certainly the war, as you pointed out, does have a real effect on how it came about opening up opportunities, et cetera, for African Americans.
Yeah. Not everybody would say this. Many people focus on this contradiction that we've been talking about between the realities of Jim Crow and the promise of democracy, that the US is engaged in this fight for democracy across the globe. But for me, and this is the thing not many people would say, it's about the economy. Many people can obviously make the observation that Black folks are like, well, wait a minute, we should have democracy too. And I argue that Black people already knew that. They already knew it was a contradiction. It's about the economy. It's about the economic conditions. It's about moving to California, New Jersey, et cetera. It's about getting better jobs. The American economy as a whole becomes a lot better during World War II and after World War II. And although Black people cannot tap into that equally, they do tap into that, absolutely. So, a lot of people use the GI Bill. People, get better jobs. They've moved cities. They have more political influence. And because of that, we get the 1950s, which we all know that the 1960s happened. We have that hindsight. But the 1950s, as they were happening, was the most rapid era of desegregation in the history of American life, until the 1960s, of course. But the 1950s were a lot more progressive racially than anything that had come before that. And that's a direct outgrowth of World War II. And there's many ways you could look at it. One's the political influence. Another is the war chest that the NAACP gets when its membership skyrockets by a factor of 10. Well, you get money. Guess what you can do with that money? You can go fight court cases like eventually Brown versus Board of Education, okay, 1954. And so I think, to me, at the end of the day, it's about the economy. And so, even though we get this message and this idea about double V, that's all important. But the resources that go into African Americans' communities, their churches, their colleges, like the number of African Americans attending college doubles in the 1950s, largely because of the economy. And so I think that is the most crucial factor for what then led up, of course, to the civil rights movement.
Well, William, you've given us a lot to consider there. And so I want to thank you very much for a terrific exchange about African Americans in the home front. Obviously, this deserves, so many more webinars and public programs, but this has really pushed the discussion forward here. So it is much appreciated. I'd like to thank our online audience for joining us today, and to make you aware of the fact that the museum will be hosting its international conference on Friday and Saturday, March 5th and 6th. It is entirely virtual and entirely free. Free is a good thing. And you can find out more information about the conference at www.2, that's the number 2, www.2conference.com. And we hope you will join us for that. So with that, let me thank everybody again, and we hope that you will join us for future events here at the National World War II Museum.